last talk of this current session. I am really happy to introduce the next group. I'm going to be brief and just introduce David because I've been told that they want all the time that they can have to talk. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the next session, Planning for Equitable Urban Density and Healthy Communities. David Moehring is an architect and capital planner with the University of Washington, Bothell. David also serves as a commissioner with the Seattle Urban Forestry Commission. David is a champion for urban density housing opportunities while maintaining an equitable urban forest, which is key in times of evidential climate change. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. And again, we have a three-part presentation that we're going to go through rather quickly here at the second last program of the day. Before I do introduce our two other presenters, how about a little round of applause for our Arbor Day Foundation, who's just been doing a great job. Thank you. What we're going to be covering today basically is three things. Seek evidence to act, obtain precedents to follow, and set forth a strategy to establish policy and governance. All is required to achieve density and healthy communities. So I've been introduced. I'll be followed by Martha Baskin. She's a freelance environmental reporter, and she's going to debut a video for us today. I'm going to kind of share some of the what's going on, but the fellow two presenters, Martha and Charles, are going to be showing us some solutions. Charles is an architect as well, so we'll have Charles Kelley from Portland, Oregon, with Green Urban Design. I also want to mention that within Martha's presentation, there's one local resident as well as two architects. So you're going to see a lot of architectural representation in this program. Our learning objectives are environmental justice must be enhancing our community forests. We'll also be looking at how to set goals and objectives, and also looking at international examples of forming sustainable governance systems, all of which will not happen by accident. It all has to be intentional. So I want to see a show of hands on some goals that we should all be looking at with our communities. If your community that you're aware of has met any of these goals, establish a district-wide regenerative sustainable system, establish strategies to defend against climate change, or establish a built environment that promotes environmental benefits to underserved communities, raise your hand. Okay, we do have a few. We have about 5. So thank you. It sounds like there's some work to be done, and we know we have some work to be done. Let's explore how urban density and healthy communities may be planned rather than just simplistic approach of just providing density like you see on the right. Well, and also think about your community. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Seattle, which make sure you enjoy the waterfront while you're here. But how is your community doing regarding these challenges? Population targets, urban heat island effects, equitable canopy cover throughout. Is your canopy increasing citywide, or is it decreasing? As you look at this diagram of Seattle, you'll notice that there's a direct correspondence where the tree canopy is relative to the surface temperature. This is something that we all know. We also find in Seattle a correspondence between higher heat, lower canopy, and inequity, of course. And this kind of diagrams an area of Seattle industrial area, the Duwamish Valley, where you have the negative effects without the tree canopy, also lined up with where we need to develop more of our parks. In fact, in November 2nd of 2022, Seattle Parks has come up with a map on the left, which basically shows where they need to provide the most tree canopy, kind of targeting a tree equity plan, which is no surprise, also corresponds with the tree map of where the canopy is. When you look outside of the city of Seattle, like a lot of people might suggest, hey, why can't we just take all the land area we can on private land, and that's going to be part of my discussion here, private land, and fill that with buildings. So we maximize the amount of land area for buildings, which makes a lot of sense. But you also look that outside of the urban areas, how much tree canopy is being lost. This diagram here is showing the tree canopy loss in about a 21-year period through harvested and other reasons. So we zoom in on one of those areas in the city of Seattle. This is again in one of the areas where we're needing more tree equity. This particular site was all forested. It was developed and subdivided into small lots, and unfortunately the lots were too small to actually replace tree canopy. Overall, in the past 5 years, Seattle has just recently updated its LIDAR study, and we've discovered that we lost about 255 acres of canopy that's kind of represented in this area of Green Lake in terms of physical area. Moreover, however, Seattle, like many communities, has a plan for how many trees we want to have by 2037. That's just 15 years away. In my opinion, if you haven't planted that tree now, we might not reach that canopy. It turns out to be about 1,000 acres of tree canopy needed to reach our comprehensive plan goal. Now, this diagram, there's many reasons for tree loss, and one of the reasons, of course, is development. This particular area of Georgetown, which is kind of in that same Duwamish Valley area, you can kind of see the left-hand side in a darker tone. That was upzoned in 2015 from single-family homes to multifamily homes. And there's an overlay with the 2016 tree canopy cover, and where the areas in red are circled is where we've kind of lost our canopy. So if that trend continues without providing plans to replace that canopy, and as Seattle and other cities look at greater density, we know what the trend might be. Looking a little bit at those trends, right now Seattle, say for example, is at 28.6% canopy. We feel fortunate, and it's dropped relatively minor. It's about 0.5% in 5 years. What if we modeled having a city where only canopy was on right-of-way and public areas? What that means is that Seattle would end up with roughly 12% citywide canopy if we just relied, and this is looking over the period of 70, 80 years of development, just planning on the street canopy that we have right now. Well, what if we double? We've heard some presentations on doubling the capacity, doubling the amount of trees within our right-of-way. Even at that case, if we double the amount of trees within the right-of-way, we'd bump up to about 17%, which is kind of like where New York City is right now, I think, in terms of canopy. The potential is there, and this diagram on the left basically shows in the tan tone where there's tree potential. And if you look at that bottom bar where it says residential, there's at least 12,000 acres of tree canopy potential. So I'm anticipating Seattle would also have that type of potential. I'm going to invite Martha to come up here and join me, but basically the conclusion here is that city codes and policies must be formed to help shape healthy communities. And there's some good examples, even in Georgetown, where you have density up along the street, you have street trees, but you also have on the private property green spaces and places for trees to grow.
Thank you, David. Yes. So as you heard from David, tree and housing-rich, dense urban communities requires planning, clear policies and stats on where canopy is needed, city buy-in, and financing at the local and federal level. It also requires architects and developers who recognize that trees and green space are community assets that make for healthy communities. When a number of us were brainstorming how best to inform city leaders that trees, housing, and density can and must coexist, we thought producing a video that showcases new housing that includes all of the above might be a good approach. Finding those architects and developers was not easy. When you've got a housing crisis and there's money to be made, the push for housing becomes imperative and can overshadow everything else, including creating the healthy, climate-resilient communities our presentation is focused on, and so many of us here. But we eventually found Ray Johnston, principal of Johnston Architects, and Davidia Kazberzik, an architect and bioregional planner. We also found a homeowner, Lois Martin, committed to saving her own mature trees in the face of a proposed affordable housing development, a project she believes can include protecting her trees. Without further ado, we are pleased to present the debut of Canopies of Green Urban Density. Of red cedars and 15 new townhouse units, a 100-year-old redwood and 4 new townhouses, a giant oak in an 82-unit cluster of mixed-use housing, density and trees, density and green space. As cities like Seattle reconstruct themselves to build housing for a growing population, density and vertical development are the buzzwords. Trees and green space are rarely included in site designs, primarily because construction permits don't require it. But some architects and policymakers recognize that trees are assets and that new development and tree canopy can coexist. Ray Johnston is one of them.
What you see ahead of you is this westerly border, and you can see a variety of trees that became part of the design. And that's kind of the unique thing about this project and a lot of our work is the trees we felt were an asset that we could work with that would enhance the character not only of the buildings that we construct on the site, but maintain the character of the neighborhood. So it's really important in that regard.
Johnston and his team of designers and arborists developed an entire city block in northeast Seattle with mixed-use residential and commercial development. Where once 2 homes and a nonprofit stood, there are now 82 units. Trees and green space were a part of the design from inception.
The giant oak tree there has been there for maybe 100 years. And there are a number of other trees, probably 8 or 9, that are of similar age, and that through negotiations with the city and a willing developer and a very creative arborist, we were able to save a majority of these large trees.
The willing developer, in this case Polygon, gave Johnston Architects the green light. Tree preservation for architects usually happens because they recognize trees are community and economic assets. But extreme weather also makes them critical urban infrastructure. Scientists have found trees can lower air temperature by as much as 14 degrees. When heat waves and wildfire smoke are commonplace, neighborhoods without mature tree canopy suffer the most. Trees provide shade and filter pollution. As Johnston looks at a grove of evergreens, vine maples, and shrubs, he says sensitivity to root configurations is critical during construction.
We've had the arborist out here frequently as we were doing excavation to make sure that root balls or significant roots were respected. And this is an important factor because it was a customizing of the approach to clearances around these trees rather than a formula.
Formula would be to stay outside the drip line, he says. But if the architect and arborist can agree to trim 15 to 20% of the root ball, a tree that might otherwise have to go can be saved. Come to another neighborhood, and several new developments stand out for their design around existing trees. Davidia Kazberzik, architect and bioregional planner, takes note of a maple on a street once named Chestnut.
But there is this fantastic maple that they set back from, and that's a really significant get for the community and allowed the tree to survive. You can see the building itself does this stepping back in 3 moves. They also allowed the natural contour of the soil here to remain. So the tree has got a nice high natural relationship to the ground.
On the other side of the development, a spruce tree holds its own in the evening light. Today, the spruce and maple flank 15 new townhouse units where once there were 5 single-family homes. On the next block, the jewel in the crown of the neighborhood, an ancient redwood, stands next to 4 new townhouses. To keep the redwood, the architects set the front and side yards back. The design served as an example for the newer 15 townhouse units. But developments like this are the exceptions in this neighborhood, as they are throughout the city. And for this, Kasperzik blames city policies.
This city has failed us, in my opinion. It didn't have to be this way. They really had the tools, they had ideas, they had policies that were actually many of them that have been proposed that have just been slow walked as trees fell, left and right.
The city's Department of Construction and Inspection issued a new draft tree code in the spring of 2022, but maximizing a lot's development potential continues to outweigh protecting existing trees. The policy isn't stopping architects we spoke with or homeowners like Lois Martin. Martin has owned her home in the city's central district for 25 years and is engaged in a determined effort to save 2 mature trees at risk from a proposed affordable housing development next to her home.
I can't think of a reason why we have to pit housing versus trees. The main reason why it is an issue has nothing to do with trees, quote unquote, being in the way, because architects can design around anything. Most of them are brilliant. And so you can find a way to design a building that will allow trees to remain while still providing housing for those that need it.
As this video was being made, an arborist with the city's Department of Construction recommended the developer redesign a driveway so that one of Martin's trees, an exceptional maple, wouldn't be impacted. Whether the recommendation will be followed is uncertain. Martin is also working to ensure the survival of a black walnut she watched grow from a seedling 25 years ago. An arborist employed by the developer said it wasn't sustainable, an opinion Martin rejects.
So if it can make it and grow to that size and that space, it can survive. It's just a matter of what we're willing to do to ensure that that happens.
The city of Seattle lost 255 acres of tree cover between 2016 and 2021. A city assessment found canopy cover was spread unevenly throughout the city, with South End neighborhoods the most adversely affected. As Seattle's tree canopy shrinks, neighborhoods lose the cooling benefits of trees, along with the livability and health benefits they provide. A recent upzoning of former single-family zones opened the door to build additional housing on nearly 70% of Seattle's land. Current development practices will likely result in the loss of even more canopy. Thoughtful development around existing trees will be key to saving Seattle's urban forest. The projects shared in this video point the way. Thank you. This was very much a joint project. The videographer couldn't be here. So the takeaways, what are they? New residential construction requires architects who recognize that density and canopy can coexist. It requires buy-in from city arborists and policymakers and a willingness to compromise. It requires architects and arborists with expertise in what trees need to survive, including respecting significant roots. The focus of this video is on new residential construction, but as we continue our presentation, we're going to take a look at what's needed to deliver a balance of housing and trees at the neighborhood scale. In the final section of our presentation, Charles Kelley, an architect with green urban design, shows us that balance in 2 U.S. cities, Portland and Washington, D.C., and Japan's signature smart city, Kashiwanoha. Kelley reminds us that when trees are a focal point of sustainable design practices, the opportunity to create equitable and low-carbon emitting neighborhoods becomes available to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction and that wonderful movie. This segment is going to look at the topic of how trees regenerate places to combat climate change. And it comes from my experience in my practice. And through my practice, I can explain through this agenda how trees are really at the intersection of this community stewardship that we need and the social cohesion that supports that community stewardship for trees, and the intersection with the urban form we need and urbanism to deliver places that can help us adapt to and can adapt to climate change that's coming. So I'll sort of restate the climate predicament that motivates me. I'll explain some of my optimism that relates to regenerative outcomes that can be delivered through urbanism, and then how important green and blue infrastructure is to supporting that new kind of urbanism, and how the neighborhood scale seems to be the right scale where you can blend systems in nature and culture and economy and the economic systems of our society together with nature. And then finally, I'll make some observations on the keys to community cohesion. So the frightening piece that should motivate us all really started in 1972 when MIT did a study that at that time anticipated what the effects of climate change would be, and they anticipated social collapse in 2060. KPMG ran the same model with updated data in 2021 and anticipate that is 20 years earlier in 2040. Now, social cohesion is in most cultures that I work in across the Pacific Rim is an anecdote to social collapse. But it's that social cohesion that we need and that stewardship that we need to actually just move the outcomes that we deliver through urban design from one that is just, hey, doing less harm, hey, I think I'm being more careful this time, hey, I'm saving a little energy, I'm being more efficient. We need to totally transform that to how can a city create abundance? How does it improve nature in the city and around the supporting areas in nature to support the species that we depend on for our survival? So we need to be regenerating, like nature, those outcomes for ourselves and the species that are around us. And that regenerative, that's a new regenerative economy. And I think we're headed that way, but we need to make a regenerative built environment that supports it. So we need this new urbanism that defends against an increasingly hostile nature due to climate change with a method that mimics the benign and productive regenerative systems that are in nature that were prior to climate change. And so it's that social cohesion that we need to make new governance structures that allow us to change the economy that relies on us managing water more carefully and reusing it more efficiently and ensuring that there's social mobility for everyone during the climate disruptions that are coming, and that we create some economic abundance and inclusive prosperity. So think this seems strange, but we hear biomimicry. Well, what if we looked at biosystem mimicry, where we're looking at larger scale systems working together with our economic systems and our social systems, and we believe that the neighborhood scale or the bioregional scale is the place where we need to rethink those systems. I think that system is really connected in my practice to how we manage green and blue infrastructure, and it's that green and blue infrastructure is the tool by which we can use to ameliorate the effects of climate change and the heat island effect in the areas of the city where we're most susceptible to climate change. And the arterials and industrial areas that David pointed out are those areas. But if you look at downtown Portland, where I've been working for the last 30 years, it's a pretty cool place on a hot day. And it's a core of our urban area. And they use trees very carefully. A project that I worked on when I was at ZGF was repurposing the transit mall for light rail. We saved every tree on that street as we rechanged its use and its economic purpose. And then we deploy trees in the downtown systematically and with the supporting community organizations. And that's in another project that I worked on when I was at ZGF Architects was the Pearl District. And we really started with the public realm being very vegetated and then spilling into the nearby park areas. Because shade and human comfort are absolutely fundamental to attracting people to live downtown. And that we did that in a way that didn't compete with the ground floor retail services that were there, that served the business interests, that their water and plants could be a setting for ecological uplift for beneficial birds and animals, and that we could make settings with water and the plants in these spaces that induce the experience of biophilia that we all need as a part of our healthy lifestyle. So I think the Pearl District was where we learned how the neighborhood scale was important to our thinking, but it wasn't until we took that through our ZGF's Eco-District initiative and worked on the net zero, or zero net for energy as measured by carbon eco-district in Washington, D.C., in the southwest rectangle, that we realized that the space between buildings plays a role in dropping the ambient temperature that reduces the need for cooling in the summertime. And because the rainfall is plentiful in D.C., it creates an opportunity and a challenge, because the rainfall in Washington, D.C., in this area now just sheet flows into the Potomac, and it created a consent decree issue for them. And quite frankly, our eco-district had to address the stormwater credit regime that they imposed, which provided many great benefits that I'll explain. But it included changing the process of water management, changed the economy for delivering development, and it put trees at the center of making the spaces cool with our water system to generate a net positive, get on the cusp of a net positive water system with a 5-year payback. And that's just selling the credits for the stormwater you keep on site in DC. We took all of this and exported green planning technology to Japan when I was at ZGF, and we took other stakeholders from Portland's green planning industry with us. And Japan had created a signature smart city that reflected the national industry's ability to develop urbanism that could retard superaging, could address decline in population, could address unplanned disasters like Fukushima, could do many things of social import that for, quite frankly, in the United States, we don't use cities for that purpose. It's so intentionally. But they were interested in using tech to connect people together in this neighborhood in a bedroom community, and our job was to add program to it and use an open space system that was populated with water and green infrastructure to connect business, research, commercial offices to a bedroom community to make it more of regenerative outcomes that they desired. But the key to this, that was the big lesson to me, was that they had a small-scale, community-oriented development organization called the Urban Design Center Cashmere, and in that organization they could direct, coordinate, and plan how the neighborhood should be developed, and they used our experience in Portland to change their environment as a community initiative, and then the stewardship was wrung from that, and the social cohesion continues to be strong, to the point where we were able to certify a LEED and D Platinum certification for this site, making it the largest LEED and D Platinum certified smart city in the world, which is really kind of a nice thing to say sometimes. But they used a detention center, a retention center in the facility in the middle of their area to convert it for something that was fenced off and unusable, changed it into a public realm, and then used the green infrastructure and that blue infrastructure to extend into the front door of the residents and the commercial spaces to connect the whole district together in a unified whole. So just a final conclusion that I can say that the keys to social cohesion, it's kind of a chicken or egg thing. You need to have enough social cohesion to have the conversation to make compact mixed-use districts. There has to be agreement that that's a good idea. That they have to have a governance structure that connects the blue and green infrastructure in your cities, and that there has to be at least an aspiration or interest to plan for economic vitality and natural uplift in your neighborhood or in your environment. And those have to be front and center if you're going to do such work. It's prevalent in Japan, not so prevalent in the United States. It could be more. And then use local governance, your commitment to each other in 2 or 3 people or your neighborhood or within multiple neighborhoods, but try and connect each other in some simple purpose to give yourself the resiliency where when something terrible happens, you can band together, but in the meantime, you can make spaces that are sustainable. So I have great enduring optimism for urbanism, so I hope you'll join me in praising the greatest technology humans have ever created. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your time. And David.
Thank you. Well, the 3 of us are available to take questions. So let's see. Here we go. And we also have our contact information here in case if you need more time to contact us later. Yes. So the question was, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. The question was how are we taking the information and applying it to equitable treatment of areas that may need it more than other areas, if I understand correctly, right? Charles, do you want to take that?
Yeah, the examples that I mean, you're on point. The things that I share with you are projects with agreements through policy and development interest in those communities. And yes, they do rely on the market, and yes, it does require rents and et cetera to get those things built. The challenge that we have is, I think, across the whole city is that there is that community cohesion around community stewardship or for trees is spotty, and the investment that it's needed in those areas where there are not enough trees, that needs to be corrected. And I think we heard many things in this conference where such principles of community stewardship, co-investment, and partnerships, I mean, that's really the focus for all the rest of Portland. I think that is what we need to do. We need to focus on the areas beyond the successful examples that I showed you.
So the question was, there's a challenge, of course, to retain trees with development because of the implied additional cost to retain trees, and there's a lot of times a template for these type of developments that regardless on the site conditions, they're kind of directed to go in that fashion. I'm not sure if you want me to. Okay, first, I think that's an excellent question and an excellent challenge. And one of the reasons why we prepared this video is because we wanted to share, at least with our Seattle leadership, is there are ways to make it happen. Now, Seattle does have some codes, and I think some other communities does as well, that says if you should have an exceptional tree, that you should prepare alternative layouts to prove that you can still achieve retain the tree and obtain the maximum floor area. So they're looking, or they're seeking essentially not to have the cookie cutter solution, but more of a site specific solution. And I think those examples are good, but I think where Seattle falls through is that a lot of times those requests are not necessarily met seriously. You know, they might submit a document that shows that there's no way to save the tree, and sometimes that's the case. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost another video that needs to be made. That's another video that it might be in the works. You know, the whole affordable, where people in Seattle are always told, well, trees are going because, quote, we need housing. And, you know, maybe 1% of the housing being built is affordable, right? So it's not affordable at all. But then as this video took months and months to produce, but then we found Lois, wonderful Lois Martin, who is lobbying hard for her trees to be protected in the face of a new Low-Income Housing Institute project. And she believes in both the housing and the trees. But now, will that housing project ultimately be built where her trees remain? We don't know. But it's a huge question that you're asking, and I'm afraid I don't really quite have the answer. Yeah. I mean, the cookie cutter projects, you carry on, David, that's, you know, they're there. We see them all over as well in Seattle. Yeah.
And I just want to put up on the screen, there are examples. This is one site where they could have the same amount of units, same amount of density, and retain the large tree, but they didn't do it. Another question? Yeah, the question basically was, you know, again, with the challenge of trying to retain trees and incentivize retaining those trees with development. And what has Seattle done or Portland has done, I'm not sure if you want to have any examples. I will share that Seattle has provided some incentives, such as reduced setbacks or shifting the setbacks in the mid-rise residential zones. They're allowed to add additional floor if they retain exceptional tree. So there are some incentives, but I hear that question often, and I think that's a key thing that municipalities have to consider. What's the incentive to retain trees? Anything else?
The opposite of that is, like in Portland, we have Title 11, which is a pretty onerous tree code for developers' perspective, but it requires it spells out all the requirements that you need to protect trees, and if you don't, what the penalties are, and they put it in their financial models, and they work through that. The really significant trees that have a community support to be saved gets extra scrutiny through that process, and raises the ante. And so people can do a lot to save trees through community action, but that baseline standard, we need people to track the trees that are being tracked, that there's compliance, and that compliance is more important now, I think, in many ways than the incentives. But that's my point.
Great. That was a comment that a planner from Tequila was saying, that they do have effective cases where they are working with the trees where they're located with development, and it seems to be working in a lot of cases. So thank you for that great example. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, Charles, Martha, for your time. I think, some of these questions we just heard actually highlight that there are still a lot of answers that we don't have. There are a lot of trade-offs that we have to make between good design, green neighborhoods, and equitable neighborhoods. And so I would just challenge you, going with the theme of the conference, of being bold, of going and talking to your planner, or if you're a planner, going and talking to your city forester or your tree board, and trying to build those bridges between disciplines so that we can really work on some of these thorny issues that I hope we can continue to figure out together. So with that, I'm going to close the urban planning session, and we're going to meet back here for the final general session for the conference. Thank you so much.